Ellen Helsper, and I'm an associate professor at the London School of Economics. So my research is really around digital media or new media, information and communication technologies, and that is, it's not that common to talk about audiences in that sphere, but all the research and the work I've done in the past was really focused on audiences, and I'm trying to take that into this new digital sphere and looking at how we can think of users of ICTs, which is what they're normally called in this field, as audiences of various kinds, or maybe how we have to adjust what we understand audiences to be in this new digital age. And that's really kind of how audiences fit into my work. I would look at a diversity of audiences, so I really look at different groups of individuals with different backgrounds and how they interact and engage differently with these various media. At the moment, I'm really looking at more social ecology approaches or social digital ecology approaches, where there's an interaction between the social context that individuals live in their everyday lives and how they shape their personalities, their interests, their motivations, but also how it's not individually constructed. So how an individual can actually be a very different type of viewer or user of media depending on the context they are in. And this context is both social, in terms of the people that surround them and the relationships that they have, but also digital. So depending, or media in this case, so depending on which media they have around them, where they've grown up, what their environment has been, this is going to determine what kind of audience or user of technology they are at that point in time, and it might differ from one day to the next, or even within a day. So I think that is kind of the kind of framework that I'm working with right now. In using this framework, I built on kind of traditional media psychology theories, such as uses and gratifications theory, or frameworks that have been used for a long time, but also on more social psychological frameworks like theories of relative deprivation or relativity, social contextualization. Domestication is an approach that feeds into this as well. Then on the other side of it, especially when I look at more how vulnerable groups engage with media, I'm using structuration theories, theories of social capital that come more from a sociological approach to engagement with media and media audiences. I think I would position myself in this as a slightly skeptical but also cautious user of the term audiences, because I think the S in the audiences is really important here. And making claims like audiences or the audience is media savvy, like all young people know what to do with technologies and engage with media all the time and they're perfectly comfortable in that environment, for example, is an overgeneralization that doesn't help anybody. And I think that's where my cautionary tale comes in. I don't think audiences are media savvy or completely clueless and victims and kind of subject to the media influences or effects that we hear other people talk about. And I think that's why it's important to think of audiences as embedded in all kinds of social structures, especially in everyday life, in their environments, their families, the schools, work, the environments that they move in, and how those might influence what they know and what they are able to do with, and how they are able to interpret content, how they are able to create content, because I think that's a very important aspect of audiences as well. So I think we need to think about it not as the audience or an effect on audiences or audiences as savvy, but as a diversity of audiences, and that we really need to understand the context of where they come from to be able to draw conclusions about their literacy or their engagement with media. I think maybe we can go back to where audiences or how audiences have been used in the past, and whatever the media of the day tended to be, the new medium, whatever that was, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 100 years ago, that was where the audience literature focused on. So for a while we've been thinking of audiences as purely associated maybe with television, as viewers of television programs. But before that, obviously, we had radio, or we had newspapers and things like that. So even that concept has evolved a little bit. I think what's happened now with the internet or information and communication technologies, which are on a series of platforms, our mobile phones, our tablets, PCs, they all form part of that media landscape. And in some ways they allow us to be a specific audience of a specific medium, like television. The fact that TV series are on Netflix or on YouTube might mean that that definition of audience hasn't changed. So some of that traditional audience is still there in the sense of a viewer who consumes content. But I do think there's something that has changed in the way we think about it, and that is that now audiences are much more active. We're moving to a much more active definition of audience, even though this was there in the past. The open text, Umberto Eco, this idea of the reader of a media text as an audience, as an active viewer constructing a meaning, constructing a reality, like almost creating the content as they are consuming it, has always been there. But I think it's now more in our face, if that's okay term to use in this context, because people are explicitly creating context, rehashing videos, but also using more active forms of viewing and consuming content across a variety of platforms. So I think as academics, we are now much more conscious of this kind of active viewer or active user and consumer of media and content. And then we have actual production. But this has always taken place. There's been fan fiction. People have always written diaries. They've always engaged with media in active ways. It was just not as publicly visible. So I think it's maybe more a little bit of a shift in how we emphasize things theoretically, but also that there's more content being produced, so that we're more aware of that these theories really need to be taken into consideration more seriously. You're making me choose a methodology. Oh gosh. I think, and this is a cop-out obviously, that there's no such thing as the perfect method to study audiences, and we really need to especially in this multimedia age, especially when we look at audiences across several contexts and in several situations, we have to take a multimedia approach. I do think that the study of audiences includes the actual study of the humans using, producing, consuming content. So for me, the methodologies that I would look at is those that engage directly with the people who are doing that, the audience. So I'd probably be less inclined to go towards things like content analysis or discourse analysis as such. And for me, the study of the audiences really needs to involve active engagement with the people who are watching it. And also not just kind of active engagement in the sense of doing individual interviews or case studies of particular viewers of a program, but really to think about diversity. And I think both in methodology, but also in terms of the audiences. So for me, that leads me to think of combinations of, for example, survey research of individuals, but looking at how they live in communities and how that community engages with media content and media products in a specific context. So that would automatically mean that there has to be something of group interviews, focus groups, observation, participant observation. So I think it's that combination. And if you're making me choose, I think I'll make the distinction in choosing for direct audience engagement research versus not doing too much of the content analysis, which has its place, but for me less in the way that I look at audiences. I think the next challenge for audience researchers is to kind of redefine what media are that we are looking at as audience researchers, and to kind of really step away from this idea of media more in a passive consumption, even if we see the audience as an active reader and an interpreter, but to really look at a kind of a more multi-platform, multimedia, or polymedia, as some authors like Mariana Miller have called it, that the media and an audience is somebody who moves around in different spaces, different media spaces, that we use all of these together to create our media experience, and that we can therefore not, it's really hard to take, for example, a television series or a film or a website or an app and study the audience of that particular platform or app or content, because we are bringing so much into that, as we've always done, but also while we're watching the film, we're probably using the app to comment on it and to create content and interact with other people. So a more social, multi-platform approach to audiences, I think, would be really interested. And I think there's also still a place for studying specific programs or specific sites or specific rituals or practices around specific media products. But I think that might have to change a little bit more in this multimedia digital age.